Hello, and welcome to my series titled Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. My name is Michael Dewan-Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach practicing in London. This is the 26th video in this series. My intention has been to provide a critique of woke psychotherapy as it is informed by critical social justice theory, while also recognizing and preserving what is good and true in it. In this video, I want to talk about the death of George Floyd. I've recently seen the film The Fall of Minneapolis by award-winning investigative journalist Liz Collins. It presents some facts that raise important questions that I want to talk about. Well, this isn't specifically about psychotherapy. It's about the misrepresentation of the truth by the woke. In other words, it's about lies that provoke intense emotions and that lead to consequential actions. This general pattern can and does also show up in psychotherapy. Following George Floyd's arrest and death on May 26, 2020, protests and riots began the next day and carried on for months around the world. Before it was over, the economic cost was estimated to be at $2 billion, and there were between 19 and 25 deaths resulting from the riots, depending on what source you rely on. There was massive collective outrage at what appeared to be a clear example of racially motivated police brutality resulting in death. Yet one more instance, it seemed, of the disproportionate killing of black people by police. George Floyd's name was now added to the list with Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Walter Scott, and others. Corporate investment in DEI programs increased by 55% in response, and BLM received millions in donations. Dare we ask whether this was all based on an accurate perception of reality? Before I go on, I just want to be clear that I think Floyd's death was a tragedy and that he didn't deserve to die. Also, given the circumstances, I believe it was imperative for there to be a full investigation into the cause of his death and a determination about whether or not and to what degree the police should be held responsible. Unfortunately, it appears that the conclusion was predetermined before all the facts were considered. What did we, the general public, have to go on for framing our perceptions? Firstly, I believe there was the underlying and widespread belief that police killing of black people is disproportionate compared to the killing of white people. This was based largely on media coverage of events over time and videos posted on the internet. In other words, it was anecdotal. I also held this perception and felt outraged by it with each new story that came out. Then I came across the research of black Harvard economist Roland Fryer, who, contrary to his own expectations, found that there is no real disparity in police killings of blacks compared to whites. When he adjusted for crime rates for blacks and the behavior of suspects, among other things, he found no disparity. He did find that there is a disparity in the use of physical force of police against black people, which is troubling. But that's separate from fatalities, which have been the primary source of outrage and protest. So that's one major thing we've based our perceptions on, and it turns out to not be true. At the very least, it is seriously questionable. Beyond this, for George Floyd in particular, we had limited video coverage showing Derek Chauvin with his knee apparently on Floyd's neck and who was complaining of not being able to breathe and then who died. Although there has been no convincing evidence that this was the case, there seems to also have been the assumption that Chauvin was acting out of racial prejudice. Beyond these things, the film, The Fall of Minneapolis, provides many more details about what really happened. These details run counter to the prevailing narrative. If you haven't seen the film, I highly recommend it. I'll provide a link to it below, as well as to Liz Collins' book, They're Lying, The Media, the Left, and the Death of George Floyd. Here, I'll merely provide a summary of what I think are some of the most important details that the film presents. First, an account of Floyd's prior criminal record. This is not to suggest that this excuses or justifies any potential wrongdoing on the part of police, but just to establish a context for their response. Floyd had previously been charged with the following: possession and delivery of cocaine, armed robbery, theft, criminal trespass, aggravated robbery with a firearm. More information came via the full police body cam of the incident, which was not made public until Chauvin's trial 10 months after Floyd's death. It shows clearly that Floyd was resisting arrest. It shows that he was complaining of difficulty breathing well before he was on the ground. It shows that there was something white and resembling a pill in his mouth. It shows that Officer Lane made calls for EMS ambulance 36 seconds after Floyd was restrained on the ground. Beyond what happened at the scene, the film also reveals the autopsy results conducted by Hennepin County's chief medical examiner, Andrew Baker, 12 hours after Floyd's death. His report states, quote, "There is no physical evidence suggesting death was caused by asphyxiation. There was no bruising found on Floyd's neck or back. The autopsy report also states that there was a pre-existing health condition, coronary heart disease, with one artery approximately 75% blocked. As well, Dr. Baker found a fatal level of fentanyl in Floyd's blood, 11 nanograms per milliliter to be precise. It's noteworthy that deaths have occurred with a level of 3. Dr. Baker reported, quote, "If he were found dead at home alone with no other apparent causes, this could be acceptable to call an OD." It's also known that intoxicants like fentanyl can exacerbate and increase the risk of death when coupled with untreated hypertension. Despite these autopsy findings, Dr. Baker's report characterized Floyd's death as a homicide caused by, quote, "cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression." While on the stand, Dr. Baker testified that nobody pressured him to include anything in his autopsy report. At the same time, Baker said that his office received, quote, "hundreds of calls, some harassing and threatening." Former Washington, D.C. medical examiner Dr. Roger Mitchell, who is an expert in in-custody deaths, also called Baker and was unhappy. Baker said the two talked about neck compression, and Mitchell also planned to publish a critical op-ed in the Washington Post. Baker said he considered Mitchell's opinion and analysis before adding neck compression to his report. So what should we believe? Consider this. In a conversation between Hennepin County prosecutor Amy Swayze, according to Swayze's own sworn statement, Dr. Baker said to her, quote, "Amy, what happens when the actual evidence doesn't match up with the public narrative that everyone's already decided on?" And then he said, quote, "This is the kind of case that ends careers." Take a moment to let that sink in. What's the implication here? Is it just possible that Dr. Baker did succumb to the pressure and decide to support the narrative rather than the facts in the end? Subsequent to Dr. Baker's report, trial lawyer Ben Crump, leader of the Floyd family legal team, announced an independent autopsy report that stated, quote, "There were no underlying medical problems contributing to his death," unquote. I don't know how these results were determined, but either an artery is 75% blocked or it isn't. And is having a fatal amount of fentanyl on board technically not a medical condition? It seems this was part of the effort to minimize anything other than the culpability of the police officers as responsible for Floyd's death. And then there's the issue of the way that Chauvin restrained Floyd on the ground with his knee apparently on his neck, but actually more on his shoulder blade. The film shows that this is a standard approach called the maximum restraint technique, or MRT. It turns out that all Minneapolis police officers are trained in it. It's described in the training manual, including an illustration that looks just like what Chauvin was doing. However, when the chief of police took the stand to provide testimony, he denied that MRT was an acceptable restraining method or that it was part of officer training. He flat out lied. The film shows several police officers affirming that it is a standard part of their training, and also shown are pages where it is described in the manual that the police get for their training. However, Hennepin County Judge Peter Cahill refused to allow a photo of MRT to be shown to the jury. Why? There's another thing that Judge Cahill refused to allow the jury to know. Remember that a call went out for an EMS ambulance 36 seconds after Floyd was restrained on the ground. The officer called dispatch, and dispatch called the ambulance. Apparently, there was a miscommunication between dispatch and the ambulance that resulted in a delayed arrival time. Judge Cahill would not allow this miscommunication to be admitted as evidence. Why? Clearly, the evidence about MRT and the EMS miscommunication would have been important for Chauvin's defense. Had the ambulance arrived sooner, perhaps Floyd would not have died. Perhaps also, if Floyd had not lied and said he had not taken any drugs when he was asked earlier during the arrest, medical help would have been called sooner. Who knows? Can we ask this question? Even if the restraint of Floyd was a contributing factor in the cause of his death, can it be deemed a murder if the restraint was an officially sanctioned part of the officer's training, when there was a serious underlying heart condition, the presence of a fatal level of fentanyl, and when emergency medical help had been summoned? How is it that Chauvin and the other officers were found guilty of murder? Considering all of these things, can we say that Chauvin and the other 3 officers who were charged were guilty of murder beyond a reasonable doubt? And what was the impact on justice when the courthouse was barricaded and the National Guard was present in case an innocent verdict resulted in violent riots? And what about the influence on the jurors, who could reasonably expect to be targeted if they didn't deliver a guilty verdict? Was this justice or a lynch mob? The prosecution's burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt is an important part of our legal system. A jury should not find a defendant guilty unless convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not necessary for the defense to prove innocence. That is presumed. Did the prosecution make a case that eliminated any reasonable doubt? Were the defendants judged by an impartial jury? I think these are important questions, and that the answer is no on both counts. What do you think? Given the evidence, it seems to me that a conviction for involuntary manslaughter would have been more just. The Minnesota statutes cover deaths caused by negligence with the felony crime of manslaughter in the second degree instead of the term involuntary manslaughter. A second-degree manslaughter conviction in Minnesota has a maximum penalty of 10 years imprisonment, along with up to $20,000 in fines. Hennepin County Judge Peter Cahill sentenced Chauvin to 22 and a half years after jurors found him guilty of second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Consider that second-degree murders typically involves intent to kill, but without premeditation. Where was the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that Chauvin intended to kill Floyd? I know many people feel satisfied and vindicated by the guilty verdict and the imprisonment of Chauvin and the other officers. I'm guessing many were also pleased to learn of Chauvin's recently being stabbed 22 times by another inmate. I don't share these feelings. I believe something went horribly wrong. Among the many other consequences of the reactions to the death of George Floyd has been a great decrease in numbers of police across the country. In Minneapolis alone, approximately 300 officers have resigned. With a nationwide increase of 72% in police resignations, there has been a corresponding increase in violent crimes. While not in any way intended, nevertheless, this has been the consequence. To boil this all down to my main point I want to make, which goes beyond the details of the death of George Floyd. There is a heavy price to pay when truth is sacrificed at the altar of worship to a zealously held narrative and ideology, when facts are twisted or omitted in order to validate the preferred story and justify the actions therefore deemed necessary. The cost builds up. Therefore, we have to be willing to ask difficult and unpopular questions and be honest, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. If the truth turns out to be that we live in a systemically unjust society based on white supremacy, we should admit it and do something about it. But if every unfortunate outcome is not the result of such a thing, we should admit that and seek alternative remedies if they exist or can be invented. In the end, the truth is more complicated than we would prefer, and knowing the truth requires more effort than we're usually willing to make. And living in and from the truth often demands more courage than we can muster. Nevertheless, that's the way it is. If you like this video, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel, click the bell for notifications, leave me a comment, and share it with a friend. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other, and don't fall for the lies. Bye for now.